d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, c5, e3, knight c6, c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop b5, c takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop d7, castle kingside, bishop d6, knight f3, bishop g4, h3, bishop h5, bishop e2, castle kingside, b3, a6, bishop b2, rook e8, knight h4, bishop g6, knight takes g6, h takes g6, bishop f3, bishop e5, knight a4, bishop takes b2, knight takes b2, knight e4, rook c1, queen f6, knight a4, rook a d8, knight c5, rook e7, rook c2, king h7, bishop takes e4, d takes e4, queen g4, rook d e8, rook d1, knight b4, rook c4, knight takes a2, rook d4, queen f5, knight takes e4, queen takes g4, h takes g4, a5, knight d6, rook d8, f4, f6, king f2, knight b4, g5, knight c6, g takes f6, g takes f6, knight takes b7, rook takes d4, e takes d4, rook takes b7, rook takes c6, rook takes b3, rook takes f6, a4, rook f7 check, king g8, rook a7, a3, king e2, rook g3, d5, king f8, king f2, rook d3, d6, rook takes d6, rook takes a3, king f7, king f3, king f6, rook a5, rook b6, King G4. Rook C6. Rook D5. Rook B6. Rook C5. Rook A6. Rook D5. Rook B6. King H4. Rook A6. G4. Rook B6. King G3. Rook B3 check. King F2. Rook A3. Rook D6 check. King F7. Rook B6. Rook C3. Rook A6. Rook B3. Rook A5. Rook C3. Rook E5. Rook A3. Rook E3. Rook A4. King F3. Rook B4. Rook A3. King E6. Rook A6 check. King F7. Rook A7 check. King F8. Rook D7. Rook A4. King E3. Rook B4. Rook D4. Rook B6. King E4. King E7. Rook D5. King E6. Rook D4. Rook A6. Rook B4. Rook C6. Rook B5. Rook C4 check. King F3. Rook C3 check. King F2. King F6. Rook E5. Rook A3. Rook E3. Rook A4. King G3. Rook B4. Rook A3. Rook C4. Rook A5. King F7. Rook A7 check. King F8. Rook D7. Rook A4. Rook D8 check. King F7. Rook B8. Rook C4. Rook D8. Rook A4. Rook D5. King E6. Rook E5 check. King F7. Rook E3. King F6. Rook C3. King F7. Rook B3. Rook C4. Rook B7 check. King F8. Rook D7. Rook A4. King F3. Rook B4. Rook D5. King E7. King E3. King E6. Rook D4. Rook B3, check. King E4. Rook B6. Rook A4. Rook B7. Rook C4. Rook A7. Rook C6, check. King F7. King D5. Rook D7, check. King C5. King G7. G5. Rook F7. King D6. Rook takes F4. Rook C7, check. King G8. Rook C5. King F7. Rook C7, check. King G8. Rook C8, check. King F7. Rook C7, check. King G8.